This program is brought to you by Stanford University. Please visit us at stanford.edu.
Maybe one of you could, even without having seen the film, tell me the rest of the plot. What will happen in this film, Song of Freedom, made in 1936? He will become a singer. He will go to Africa. What else? Yes? Yeah, that song that he sings will play a crucial role in the plot because, of course, those of you who were here at the beginning of the film, that song comes from the place where he was born in Africa, and I guess the amulet he's wearing also is passed down through the generations. What happens later on in the film is that the character, he sings that as the encore as he becomes a singing sensation throughout the world. And he sings this little song that he doesn't know the origins of. One time, a person, I guess an anthropologist from who had been in Africa, comes up after the encore and says, "I know that language," and it's from a particular place in Africa. And so at that point, the Paul Robeson character knows, home. You know, that's where he's got to go, and now he has the means to do it. Gives up his singing career, goes back. The rest of the film, the politics of it are a little bit mixed up in the sense that he goes back because he wants to bring civilization to Africa. And they don't respond too well to that, and just as they're about to kill him, do him in, he starts singing his song, and then they recognize he's a brother, and that saves his life. And then, of course, they recognize that he's there to help them, and that's really the end of the film. He goes back and has the rest of his career.
The song he sings is in English.
Well, he sings certain words for the song that he remembers from his mother telling him, and that kind of becomes the key to where he was from in Africa. Now, why is this film important to show? I think, first of all, it'd be nice if all of you could at some point check this out and look at the whole film. What would be remarkable about this film being made in 1936? What do you know about the role of African Americans in film during the 1930s? Who was the top movie star? Stephen Fetchit is the highest paid movie star. What kinds of roles does he play in Hollywood? Yes?
Sort of like Bojangles kind of comical type character.
Yeah, he's just kind of comic relief, the shuffling, kind of slow-witted, slow-talking person who, but he's thrown into Hollywood films in order to provide the audience with a laugh. Who else? Hattie McDaniel. What roles is she most famous for? Mammy and Gone with the Wind. So that's the kind of roles that made a career for people in Hollywood. Then you have Paul Robeson. Where is this film being made? Is it made in Hollywood? Obviously not. I mean, everyone there has a British accent except for Paul Robeson, who somehow fits in. But he's making films outside the United States, even though he could have been a film star, and indeed he was a film star. What was his most famous role up to that point? Showboat. And the song Old Man River, which the song and the film become great hits, make Paul Robeson a national star. But rather than following a career in Hollywood where he would have been placed in these kinds of roles, he goes abroad and makes most of his films outside the United States, where he has a great deal more freedom. Does anything about the film surprise you in terms of just the parts of it you saw? Yes?
I was surprised at how freely he spoke to the white character.
Yeah, the interaction, would you have ever seen that kind of social interaction between white characters and black characters in a Hollywood film? No, not. Even the Hollywood films where there were black characters, for example, many Hollywood films had a nightclub scene. The white characters would go into a nightclub, and up on the stage there might be a black act being performed at the Cotton Club or something like that. But you will notice that the only black people in the club are on the stage. There's no social interaction that is shown in the films. And in fact, in many of these films, when the film was shown in the South, those scenes were cut. Even to have that part of it was not acceptable. But you definitely couldn't have the interaction of black characters. Anything else about it? Yes?
Seeing there in the film concert.
Yeah.
And then also, the guy says he doesn't care about the color of his skin, but he cares about the color of his voice.
Yeah. What about the Paul Robeson character? What's very striking about that? I mean, what about that interest in Africa? I mean, even for 1960, much less 1930, to have a character who thinks positive thoughts about Africa. What is the portrayal of Africa in films to this point in the 1930s? How do Americans see Africa through films? Yes.
Like a wild jungle.
Yeah. I mean, the most of the depictions of Africa in films is Tarzan. So you see Africa as simply a savage backdrop to what's going on in the movie, where the white characters play the central role. It's almost, this film really stands out, even though so much of it seems stilted, and the way in which he expresses his interest in Africa doesn't seem very natural. But imagine a black audience in the 1930s where typically, if you went to a film, what you would get is a black person on the screen portraying a fairly negative stereotype. And here's a film where the black character is actually saying, I want to go to Africa. This is my dream in my life. When I get success, that's what I want to do with that success. I mean, it's really, well into the 70s and 80s before you have any films that begin to depict that kind of sense of Africa by African Americans. Okay, who is Paul Robeson? He's one of my favorite people to talk about because he's really a very remarkable individual, someone who seems like he's larger than life, someone who accomplished so much during his lifetime. Just a little overview: he was born in 1898 in New Jersey, went to Somerville High School, became a star in just about all aspects of student life, acting, singing, athletics, a person who lettered in lots of different sports, but played football primarily. Went on to get a scholarship at Rutgers College, and there he went out for the football team. They had never had a black player before. He tells this story about how when he first arrived to try out for the football team, the white players did not want to accept him, and he actually got his nose broken and his right shoulder dislocated in the first practice he went to. And because they made it clear they did not want him on the team. And he thought about quitting, and his brother came and told him that you don't quit anything. And he went back out, and there's another story in which the second practice, when someone tried to do that, he picked up the guy and was about to throw the other player down when the coach stepped in and finally decided that they had to accept him because, first of all, he was the biggest player on the team, and it turned out he was the best player on the team. He was an All-American football player at Rutgers. He was also a basketball player, played baseball, star in track, discus, shot put, javelin. During his time at Rutgers, he was elected to Phi Beta Kappa, acted, sang in the Glee Club, ended up with 12 varsity letters in sports at Rutgers, and did an honors thesis there on the importance of the 14th Amendment. And he called it the sleeping giant of the Constitution, something that would indicate his political interests. After leaving Rutgers, he decided to become a professional football player. This might be surprising when we think about the role of Jackie Robinson in breaking the color barrier in baseball, but in part because football at that time was not considered as a major sport. There were black players and even black coaches in professional football during that time. So he played at the Polo Grounds while going to Columbia Law School. And he basically played professional football to earn his tuition money. And it was when he was playing professional football he got injured and went to the hospital. And it was there that he met Essie Eslanda Cardozo Good, who became his wife. She was one of the first black pathologists. She saw him in the hospital. They started talking to see a black woman who was doing professional work at that time, was very impressive to him. He married her, and it was during this period right after they got married that he changed his career focus. He graduated from law school, had his law degree. One of the things he found was that there wasn't very much of a future for a black person. He went to work for a white law firm, and the white secretary would not take dictation from him. Faced other kinds of things, but he also had this interest in the arts that he had developed before that. And this is the 20s, at a time when black culture is being expressed, what leads to the Harlem Renaissance, but you begin to see the emergence of black people as playing a role on Broadway, playing a role in the theater. And you have Eugene O'Neill as a playwright writing roles for black characters, including All God's Children Got Wings, The Emperor Jones. And The Emperor Jones is a role that makes Robeson a star on Broadway. So he takes on this acting first as kind of a part-time role and then as his main career. And it's during the early 1930s he develops his acting career. By the late 30s he begins to sing more. And he's unique in the sense that he wants to sing African American material. And so by the late 1930s he's developing his acting, his singing, and it's at that point, at the end of the 1930s, that he plays in Showboat, sings the Old Man River, and from that point on, he's a well-known star throughout the nation, probably one of the best-known black actor in Hollywood films. So we get him to the point in the 1930s where he's making Song of Freedom. And what I think this represents is a point in his career, a turning point in his career, because unlike other black actors and artists, he takes control of his career and wants to take it in his own direction, and that is toward a political stand and toward a positive interest about African affairs. What we also find is that Essie Robeson plays a role alongside him in terms of this developing interest in Africa. Both take a very serious interest by learning African languages. While he's in London making this film, he's also going to college and developing his interest in language. Eventually he learns more than a dozen languages fluently. He sings many of his songs in the native language. And this again makes both of them quite unique. And there's a passage from Essie Robeson while Paul is developing his acting career. She's actually going to Africa, studying African cultures, and Awele will read a passage from her diary, her journal, from one of her stays in Africa.
This is going to Africa.
Yeah, going to Africa.
Okay. In America, one heard little or nothing about Africa. I hadn't realized that consciously until we went to live in England. In England, on the other hand, there is news of Africa everywhere, in the press, in the schools, in the films, in conversation. English people are actively interested in Africa economically and politically. When we first went to England, I remember how startled I was by all this readily available information on Africa. I had thought somewhat complacently, I'm afraid, that I was well informed about the Negro question. There in England, I was disconcerted by the fact that the Negro problem was not only the problem of 13 million Negroes in America, but was and is for the greater problem of the 150 Negroes in Africa, plus the problem of the 10 million Negroes in the West Indies. Later on, much later, when I finally began to find out what it was all about, I came to realize that the Negro problem was not even limited to the problem of the 173 million black people in Africa, America, and the West Indies, but actually included, and does now especially include, the problem of 390 million Indians in India, the problem of 450 million Chinese in China, as well as the problem of all minorities everywhere. After more than a year of a very wide reading and intensive study, I began to get my intellectual feet wet. I soon became fed up with the white students and teachers interpreting the Negro mind and character to me, especially when I felt, as I did very often, that their interpretations were wrong. It was something like this. Me? I'm a Negro. I know what we think, how we feel. I know this means that, and that means so and so. Ah, no, my dear, you're wrong. You see, you are European. You can't possibly know how the primitive mind works until you study it, as we have done. What do you mean I'm European? I'm a Negro. I'm African myself. I'm what you call primitive. I have studied my mind, our minds. How dare you call me European? No, you're not primitive, my dear, they told me patiently, tolerantly. You're educated and cultured, like us. I'm educated because I went to school, because I was taught. You're educated because you went to school, you were taught. I'm cultured because my people had the education and the means to achieve a good standard of living. That's the reason you're cultured. Poor whites have neither education nor culture. Africans would have both if they had the schools and the money. Going to school and having money doesn't make me European. Having no schools and no money doesn't make the African primitive. I protested furiously. No, they explained. The primitive mind cannot grasp the kind of ideas we can. They have schools, but their schools have only simple subjects and crafts. It's all very different. You see, we've been out there for years and years, some 10, some 20, some 30 years. We've studied them, taught them, administered them, worked with them, and we know. You've never been out there. You've never seen them and talked with them on their home ground. You can't possibly know. It all sounded nonsense to me, and yet in the last bit made sense. Maybe I better check it out. Paul and I began to seek all of the Africans we could find everywhere we went, in England, Scotland, Ireland, France, in the universities, on the docks, in the slums. The more we talked with them, the more we came to know them, the more convinced we were that we were the same people. They know us, we know them, we understand their spoken and unspoken word. We have the same kind of ideas, the same ambitions, the same kind of humor, many of them the same values. I asked Africans I met at universities taking honors in medicine and law and philosophy and education and other subjects, what is all this about primitive minds and abstruse subjects about only simple subjects and crafts in your schools? Oh, that, they said with a twinkle. There's nothing primitive about our minds in these universities, is there? And how can we cope with any but simple subjects and crafts in our schools when that is all they will allow us to have? Actually, they rarely give us any books at all, but they sometimes aid the schools the missions have set up for us, and those we have set up for ourselves with our own money and labor, but they definitely limit our curricula. I began to see the light. It was the old Army game every Negro in America will recognize. The white American South says the Negro is ignorant and has a low standard of living. The Negro says the South won't give them adequate schools or decent wages. With new confidence, I began to ask more questions in seminars, and always I came up against the blank wall. But I was out there 30 years, I know. You have never been out there. You simply don't know. So I went.
So by the end of the 1930s, for Paul Robeson and S.E. Robeson, you can see that their interest in Africa culminates in the founding of the Council on African Affairs, the lobbying group that I mentioned before. And for both of them, there's a move to the left during the 1930s, which is not that surprising. We see this with Du Bois. We also see this with Shirley Graham, about whom I've talked before. And I think with Robeson, though, this is a move that we see in terms of his use of his art to make a political point. And this can be seen in the late 1930s when he goes to Spain to support the Republican cause in the Spanish Civil War. Some of you may know that the Spanish Civil War played a major role in terms of world events because it was kind of a precursor to World War II. The Spanish Republican cause against the fascist, in this case Franco, forces in Spain. Many of the people on the left, including many communists from the United States and what were called fellow travelers, actually went to Spain to fight on the side of the Republicans in Spain. You also this was called the Abraham Lincoln Brigade. They still have reunions. Actually, I went to one in the Bay Area of some of the veterans. There's about, I think last time I checked, there was 4 of them left who were part of this American group that went to Spain in the late 1930s. Well, Paul Robeson and Langston Hughes also went there to give their support, not to fight in the war, but Robeson to sing to the troops and to help sustain their morale. Well, by the time of World War II, there's some similarities with what happens with other people on the left, and that is that they support the war effort because, after all, this is the Allies include the Soviet Union. There's no division on the question of World War II. For Paul Robeson, he spends the wartime, trying to build support for the Allied cause. And he gains a new fame when he sings a song called Ballad for Americans. And I'll play a little bit of it. There's a film I want to play at the end that has a selection from Ballad for Americans. Anyone know anything about that? Any of you heard it, by the way? It's a patriotic song that was written and during the late 1930s, and it was performed by Robeson at many concerts to build support for the war effort. And it was recorded and actually had its premiere on CBS Radio. And after that, there was a lot of demand for Robeson to come to many places. The Hollywood Bowl, for example, in Los Angeles, he performed there. Came to San Francisco and sang for it. I understand that 30,000 people came to the Hollywood Bowl to listen to him. So he became the nation's favorite black male singer during the early 1940s. And then he took the lead role in Othello on Broadway, and played this Shakespearean play, had its longest run ever on Broadway, and again strengthened his career during the war, so that by the end of the war, he is without question the leading black actor, black singer, the person that other people look up to, and one of the things we'll see later on is that for younger people like Ossie Davis, Ruby Dee, Sidney Poitier, Harry Belafonte, these people all looked to Robeson as their role model, the person they admired greatly. And in fact, the film I'll show you later about Robeson's life is narrated by Sidney Poitier, who saw himself as kind of a protege of Paul Robeson. Well, what happens after the war? I think we can guess what is going to happen from the previous lecture, in that many people on the left face persecution during the post-war years, during as anti-communist policies become ever more forceful. And for Robeson, this coincides with a decision he makes right after the war to de-emphasize his career as an entertainer and to devote himself almost entirely to political work. He begins to sing increasingly at labor rallies, to take part in the effort to oppose the Cold War, peace rallies, efforts to cement or to build up greater friendship with the Soviet Union rather than seeing them as an enemy. He rallies support for anti-lynching efforts. This leads him, for example, to, I think in the textbook, there's a little part that has to do with his meeting with Truman, where he goes and meets with Truman to protest against the violence that is occurring against black returning soldiers and other black people in the South, and demand that Truman do something. This doesn't end well. Truman basically is offended because of the way in which Robeson speaks to him. Robeson finally, though, gets into a great deal of trouble when he makes a statement at the World Congress of Partisans of Peace in Paris in 1949 in April. And he he delivers a speech at this Congress, which was designed to prevent the Cold War from leading to a nuclear war. And he made a statement that black Americans would not get caught up in the hysterical raving that urges us to make war on anyone. And he says, our will to fight for peace is strong. We shall not make war on anyone. We shall not make war on the Soviet Union. This was quoted back in the United States as, it is unthinkable that American Negroes would go to war on behalf of those who have oppressed us for generations against the country, the Soviet Union, which in one generation has raised our people to the full dignity of mankind. That was probably what Robeson meant, and he had said similar things on many occasions. But what it came down to was, it was interpreted as a statement of disloyalty to the United States. Because basically what he's saying is that if the Cold War culminates in a war with the Soviet Union, black Americans are not going to fight. Well, you can imagine the reaction back in the United States to this statement. That by the time he gets back to the United States, nearly all of the moderate NAACP type leaders have condemned Robeson and said that he doesn't speak for black Americans. We are loyal to the country. We'll fight, as always, in America's wars. And among those who take a leading role in this attack on Robeson is Jackie Robinson. And Jackie Robinson, as you know, in 1947, so this is 2 years before this, becomes the black athlete who integrates baseball. And ironically, Robeson had taken as one of his causes to bring about the desegregation of baseball, Major League Baseball. So Jackie Robinson, in some ways, is a beneficiary of Robeson's earlier work. But after that, Jackie Robinson, as the most popular figure by 1949, most popular black person in America, it was quite natural that people would go to him who were opposed to Robeson and say, it is important for you to make a statement. And Jackie Robinson goes before Congress, is invited to testify, and he uses this as an occasion to basically say that Robeson doesn't represent black America. Now, this had a tremendous impact, and I'll talk a little bit later about another incident where Paul Robeson tries to give a concert at Peekskill, New York. Rioting breaks out when the American Legion and other groups that are opposed to Robeson go there and begin throwing rocks at cars that are attending and begin turning over cars and attacking the people who had gone to the concert. After that, any place that invites Robeson, there's pressure to cancel the invitation, to not make auditoriums available to him, so that by the end of 1949, his career as entertainer is basically over, and he is effectively silenced. Now, Awele also has a selection from what Robeson's response to Jackie Robinson's attack on him. And I want to go ahead and read that.
Let's not be divided. July 1949. Robeson said he knew reporters would have a better story if he attacked Robinson, but I'm not going to permit this issue to boil down to a personal feud between myself and Jackie. To do that would be to do exactly what the other group wants us to do. Let's not fall for anything like that. The issue is not the loyalty of the Negro people, because that is not a subject of debate. The real issue is whether the Negro people would permit themselves to be divided by a group, such as the Un-American Activity Committee in their fight for peace and human dignity. The committee's efforts to make the loyalty of the Negro people an issue is an insult. How do they dare to question our loyalty? I challenge the loyalty of the Un-American Activities Committee. The truth is that the action of the committee is just one step from the herding of black people into concentration camps. It is therefore very important that the Negro press step forward and defend not me, but the Negro people. We cannot forget that the John S. Wood, chairman of the committee, once called the Ku Klux Klan an American institution. Why then should Negroes pick this type of committee to express their loyalty? Why did the committee merely question the loyalty of Negroes? How about the Italians? Did Joe DiMaggio go down there to testify? It should be clear that Robinson, be appearing before this committee, has performed a profound political act that has aided those who would enslave the Negro. He erred, too, in stating to this committee that the Negro didn't need to help the communists. The Negro needs the help of all communists or non-communists, but it does not need the aid of a man who once called the Ku Klux Klan an American institution. My main concern is to get at this Un-American Activities Committee. Again, I repeat, I am willing to appear before the committee at any time. The statement I made before the Paris Peace Conference has been distorted. I am not interested in the war, but in peace. And here is what I said at the conference. It is unthinkable that the Negro people could be lured into any kind of war, especially against the Soviet Union, where former colonial people have complete equality. The question is, will the Negro be drawn into a war which can only extend their enslavement, or will they fight for peace? If we were to go to war today, we'd be fighting for those who represent fascist Germany, the British Empire, and the 1% of Americans that exploit the other 99%. I have no desire of being a black Stalin. All I want to do is to sing and act. These things I feel I will be able to do always. Negroes have a chance in this period to make greater gains than ever before. They must be militant, and they will succeed. Jackie Robinson told the committee about his willingness to fight for his investment in America, but it is not a question of going to war, but a question of struggling for peace. When Jackie speaks of investment, he should remember that I too have an investment in the United States, but I can't forget what could happen to my investment overnight under present conditions. The truth is that 85 concert engagements of 9 have been canceled of a total of 85. But this does not worry me in the least, since I can always find places to sing. Nor will it prevent me from earning a living, because long ago I prepared myself to sing in the various languages of the world. And as a result, I can now go to Alaska or Hong Kong and make a living there. But they can't scare me, and they can't run me out of this country. I gave them a chance to throw me in jail. I refuse to answer to that certain question. Permit me to deny 2 reports. First, I did not write to Jackie Robinson asking him not to appear before the committee. Second, I did not say at Paris that colored people would not fight in a war against Russia. But when it became obvious to me that the statement I made had been purposely distorted, I said to myself, okay, let it stand like that. But now the organizations such as the House Un-American Activities Committee are attempting to use it to their advantage. I am taking the attitude, let's put the statement back into the context now.
According to Jackie Robinson's biographer, Arnold Rampersad, on the faculty here, Robinson later regretted making the statement that he did, and he felt that he had been used in order to damage Paul Robeson. But in any case, I think Robeson himself overestimated his ability to use his fame and his stature as an entertainer in order to counter that. He mentions, for example, that, well, you know, they can't, what can they do to me? I can go and sing in Hong Kong. I can go to Alaska. Well, what he didn't count on is that his passport could be taken away. and his passport was taken away to prevent him from traveling, along with Du Bois's passport and the passports of many other people on the left whose the State Department's argument here was that a passport is not a right of American citizen. It is a privilege, so therefore it can be taken away, it can be denied, including for reasons of national security, that is, preventing people who might make statements abroad that would be counter to the interests of the United States. Now, this was eventually overturned by the Supreme Court in 1957, but in between that time of the early 1950s to 1957, both Robeson and Du Bois were denied the right to travel outside the United States. And for both of them, this was a time when there were very few avenues for them to get their views heard. Actually, when I was growing up during the 1950s and became politically active in the 1960s, I had heard very little about either Du Bois or Paul Robeson, other than knowing that Du Bois wrote Souls of Black Folk, what happened to him, where he was, and in fact there were newspaper articles that said the late Paul Robeson, even though he didn't die until the 1970s. But that kind of gives you an idea of the extent to which both of these individuals had gone from the pinnacle of fame to obscurity by the mid-1950s. Now, I wanted to finish by playing part of a film that was, I mentioned, made by Sidney Poitier as a tribute to Paul Robeson. And in this film, they play on Paul Robeson's most famous song, Old Man River. And they note how early in his career, he sang the song with the words that Oscar Hammerstein had put in it, including the use of the term nigger as part of the song, and how he had gone to, he had sang that in that form when it was originally performed on Broadway, but insisted that when it was made into a film that they changed the word to darkies, which was a little bit better. And then during his career, he continues to sing the song, but changes the words. And by looking at the way the words change over time, you're able to trace Paul Robeson's career. Paul Robeson's life, Shirley Graham's, S.E. Robeson, and W.E.B. Du Bois. One of the things that strikes me about what they represented during the 1940s and the significance of their being silenced in the 1950s is that they represented a vision of the relationship between the African American struggle and the anti-colonial struggle that is very important still in African American life. We don't see that coming together of those issues again until the late 1960s, when we see a revival of this interest in the affairs of African nations and the relationship of their struggles for freedom. And we can look forward into the South African struggle and the struggle of African Americans for civil rights. And I think that what that means is that for a 20-year stretch, African American politics was hobbled by a limited vision. That is, when we enter the 1960s and the dominance of the NAACP and this entire focus on what is happening with African Americans, and the only way in which foreign affairs comes into the picture is as a leverage, basically, of saying that it's in the Cold War interest of the United States to grant civil rights to African Americans. But the idea of building bridges with the African struggle is something that only gradually redevelops during the late 1950s and early 1960s with the emergence of someone like a Martin Luther King. And I think one of the significances of Martin Luther King, and I think his primary significance, I'll argue later, was not so much his role as an organizer, as a person who mobilized things, because as we will find out, it's when we look at the Montgomery bus boycott, it's really the women in Montgomery who organized the boycott, and Martin Luther King kind of takes over as the spokesperson for that movement. But rather his significance comes out of his vision. His ability to say that this local struggle of black people in Montgomery for the right to sit where they want on a bus has national and international significance. That this is related to, and this is something that he begins to say, this is related to the struggles of Africans for liberation from colonialism. It's related to the third world struggles that are going on throughout the world. So that kind of broad vision, I think, only gradually comes back into the African American struggle because of the role of the Cold War in dividing the African American political community between those who believed that there was this unity and those who, for pragmatic reasons, wanted to play down that connection. Are there any questions? Clarence, I just wonder, Clarence Jones is here, and sometimes I just kind of pass him by, but in terms of not asking, what do you think? Because he knows many of these individuals, and I'm just wondering if you have any reflections on your thoughts about them.
One anecdote that might, I think, be significant in terms of Paul Robeson. I think, by the way, the comments you made about Martin and taking the local division and making it national. One anecdote, when I was a young man playing football in 1949 and 1950 at Columbia University, and I was also engaged in campus politics. I was criticized by my colleagues in campus politics because I could never hand out leaflets. They would be handing out leaflets on 116th Street in front of the university because I'd be playing football or I'd be going to football practice. And I come to know Paul Robeson as a young man who was a good friend of mine. And I told Paul Robeson about this. And he said to me something I always remember. He said, young man, he said, you go back and tell your friends is that one touchdown by you, a Negro, on Saturday at Bakersfield Stadium will have more impact on anything that those leaflets can say that they're handing out. In other words, it was very much a sports personality. He was saying that the impact of me as a Negro athlete scoring a touchdown. I mean, Bakersfield is like, you see television pictures of football, the stadium is full, primarily of white people. So he was saying one touchdown by a Negro would have more impact on white people than anything that I could be handing out in those leaflets. The thing I remember.
Any other comments or questions? How many of you before this class had ever heard of Paul Robeson? About half, yeah. And I would guess that if I had asked that question in the mid-1960s, it would probably be very, very few. I mean, that was how totally he had kind of been obliterated. There is another anecdote that a few years back, maybe about 10 years ago, there was a ceremony at the National Football Hall of Fame. And it was in honor of Paul Robeson as a football player. And it was because after he had been essentially blacklisted because of the Cold War, there was a list of all-American football players. The one for 1919 had 10 players on it. The obliteration of him from history was so complete that they would not even recognize that he had been an all-American football player, and his name was taken off the list. So there was a ceremony at the Hall of Fame game. I guess it's played during the summer and every year to kind of raise money for the Hall of Fame. They had a wonderful ceremony to add his name back onto the list, and in this way say, yeah, he did exist as a football player, and that it had been wrong to kind of ignore that. But that was a major step in terms of the rehabilitation. Of course, it came way too late for him, but his son was there for the ceremony. See you next time.
The preceding program is copyrighted by Stanford University. Please visit us at stanford.edu.